On the morning of September 6, 1976, a Soviet Air Force pilot named Viktor Belenko climbed into the cockpit of his MiG-25 Foxbat interceptor at Chuguyevka Air Base in the Soviet Far East, started the engines, and made a decision that would shake the foundations of Cold War military intelligence. But this story isn't about Belenko's defection to Japan, dramatic as it was. This is about another incident, less famous but equally revealing, that occurred just over a decade later when a Soviet bomber crew found themselves on Iranian soil, having accidentally crossed one of the most sensitive borders in the world during a period of extraordinary tension. The date was November the 23rd, 1987, and the aircraft was a Sukhoi Su-24 Fencer, one of the Soviet Union's most capable strike bombers, loaded with classified avionics and carrying crew members who knew far too much about Soviet military operations along the southern frontier. To understand how a sophisticated military aircraft, flown by trained professionals, could end up in the wrong country, we need to understand the context of Soviet military aviation in the 1980s, the geopolitical landscape of the Iran-Iraq War, and the specific circumstances that led to this embarrassing breach of protocol. The Su-24 Fencer was not some antiquated relic. It was a swing-wing, all-weather attack aircraft that entered service in 1974, designed specifically to penetrate enemy defenses at low altitude and high speed. By 1987, it represented the cutting edge of Soviet tactical aviation, equipped with sophisticated terrain-following radar, advanced navigation systems, and the ability to deliver both conventional and nuclear weapons with precision. The fact that such an aircraft could go astray reveals much about the operational realities of the Soviet Air Force during this period, realities that were far removed from the image of mechanical perfection the Kremlin wanted to project. The crew of this particular Su-24 were based at Mary Air Base in the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, now Turkmenistan, positioned strategically near the borders of Iran and Afghanistan. This was not a quiet backwater posting. The Soviet Union was deep into its catastrophic intervention in Afghanistan, and the southern military districts were on constant alert. The airspace along the Soviet-Iranian border was among the most heavily monitored in the world, not just by Soviet forces, but by American intelligence assets. Iranian air defenses and Iraqi reconnaissance, the Iran-Iraq War, which had been raging since 1980, had turned the Persian Gulf region into a powder keg of competing interests. The Soviet Union officially maintained neutrality in the conflict, but leaned toward Iraq, providing weapons and intelligence support to Saddam Hussein's regime, while simultaneously trying to maintain workable relations with revolutionary Iran. On that November morning, the Su-24 crew received orders for what should have been a routine training flight. The mission profile called for low-level navigation exercises along the Soviet side of the border, practicing the kind of terrain-hugging flight that would be essential in wartime to avoid enemy radar detection. These exercises were conducted regularly, keeping pilots sharp and testing the capabilities of the aircraft's automated systems. The crew consisted of a pilot and a weapons systems officer, both experienced aviators who had flown this route before. Weather conditions were reported as acceptable, though visibility was reduced by seasonal dust and haze common to the region. The flight plan had been approved through the proper channels, and the aircraft was fueled and armed with training ordnance, not live weapons, though it carried all its standard avionics and navigation equipment. What happened next remains somewhat disputed in the details, but the broad outline is clear from both Soviet and Iranian sources. Shortly after takeoff, as the Su-24 descended to low altitude to begin the navigation exercise, something went wrong with the aircraft's navigation systems. The most likely explanation, based on subsequent investigations, is that the crew experienced a malfunction in the aircraft's autopilot or navigation computer, possibly exacerbated by human error in programming the flight path. The Su-24's terrain-following radar was designed to keep the aircraft at a safe altitude above the ground while flying at high speed, but it required accurate navigation input to know where it was relative to the planned route. If the navigation system provided incorrect position data, the crew might not realize they had strayed off course until it was too late. The border between the Soviet Union and Iran in this region runs through harsh, mountainous terrain that gradually gives way to desert. From the air, especially at low altitude in reduced visibility, one stretch of barren landscape looks much like another. The crew would have been focused on maintaining proper altitude, monitoring their instruments, and following what they believed was their assigned route. Soviet military doctrine emphasized strict adherence to flight plans and procedures, but it also demanded that crews maintain proficiency in manual flying skills. The tension between trusting automated systems and maintaining situational awareness through visual references was a constant challenge, one that became more acute as aircraft grew more complex. At some point during the flight, the crew crossed the border into Iranian airspace. They may not have realized it immediately. The border itself was not marked by any visible feature that would be obvious from a fast-moving aircraft at low altitude. Iranian air defense systems, however, detected the intrusion almost immediately. The Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, despite suffering significant losses during years of war with Iraq, maintained a network of radar stations and interceptor aircraft along its borders. The appearance of a Soviet military aircraft, particularly a strike bomber, in Iranian airspace during daylight hours was an extraordinary event that triggered an immediate response. Iranian F-4 Phantom II fighters, American-built aircraft that had been supplied to the Shah's regime before the 1979 revolution, scrambled to intercept the intruder. The Iranian pilots, veterans of countless engagements with Iraqi aircraft, approached the Su-24 with weapons armed and ready. The Soviet crew, suddenly aware they were being intercepted by fighters that were clearly not Soviet, faced a desperate situation. They could not outrun the F-4AS, and any attempt to fight would have been suicidal, assuming their weapons were even armed for combat, which they were not. The pilot made the only rational decision available. He began looking for a place to land. Iranian ground controllers, monitoring the situation, directed the Su-24 toward Tabriz Air Base in northwestern Iran. The city of Tabriz, with a population of over 1 million, was a major urban center and home to significant military installations. The air base there had the facilities to handle a large military aircraft and was secure enough to prevent the Soviet crew from attempting escape. Under escort by the Iranian fighters, the Su-24 landed at Tabriz. The crew, knowing they faced an uncertain fate, had no choice but to comply with Iranian instructions. They touched down on Iranian soil with their aircraft intact, its systems functional, and its secrets exposed. The immediate aftermath of the landing set off a cascade of diplomatic and intelligence activities. The Soviet government, informed of the incident through military channels, faced an acute embarrassment. A frontline strike bomber with all its classified equipment was now in the hands of a government that had complicated relations with Moscow and, more critically, had connections to the United States through various intelligence channels despite the official hostility between Washington and Tehran. The Kremlin needed to recover both the crew and the aircraft, but doing so required delicate negotiations with a revolutionary Islamic government that was unpredictable and often hostile to Soviet interests. The Iranians, for their part, recognized the intelligence windfall that had literally fallen into their laps. The Su-24 was not just a military aircraft. It was a treasure trove of information about Soviet avionics, weapons systems, radar technology, and operational procedures. Iranian technicians, some trained in the United States before the revolution, began examining the aircraft immediately. They photographed every detail, studied the cockpit layout, analyzed the radar systems, and documented the communication equipment. The two Soviet crew members were detained and interrogated, though by most accounts they were treated correctly according to international norms for military personnel who had inadvertently entered foreign territory. Within hours of the landing, the Soviet embassy in Tehran activated emergency protocols. Ambassador Vladimir Vinogradov, a career diplomat who had navigated the treacherous waters of Soviet-Iranian relations since before the revolution, contacted the Iranian Foreign Ministry to demand the immediate return of the aircraft and crew. The Soviets characterized the incident as a navigation error, a technical malfunction that had caused an inadvertent border violation during a routine training flight. They emphasized that the aircraft carried no hostile intent, was not armed with live weapons, and had landed peacefully when intercepted. The diplomatic note stressed the importance of maintaining good relations between neighboring states and invoked international conventions regarding military aircraft that stray into foreign airspace due to technical problems. The Iranian response was measured but firm. Foreign ministry officials acknowledged the Soviet explanation but noted that the violation of Iranian airspace was a serious matter, particularly given the ongoing war with Iraq and the heightened state of alert along all Iranian borders. They indicated that the crew would be treated well and that the aircraft would be examined to verify Soviet claims that it carried no hostile payload. What remained unsaid, but understood by all parties, was that Iran would extract maximum intelligence value from the aircraft before considering its return, and that the incident provided leverage in the broader relationship between Tehran and Moscow. Behind the scenes, a more complex game was unfolding. American intelligence agencies, monitoring Soviet and Iranian communications, became aware of the incident within hours. The CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency saw an opportunity. If the Iranians could be persuaded to provide access to the Su-24 or share intelligence gathered from examining it, the United States could gain invaluable insights into Soviet military technology. However, the geopolitical situation was extraordinarily complicated. The Iran-Contra affair had exploded into public view just a year earlier, revealing secret American arms sales to Iran in violation of official policy. Relations between Washington and Tehran remained officially hostile, yet covert channels of communication still existed. The Reagan administration had to weigh the intelligence value of the Su-24 against the diplomatic risks of any contact with Iran regarding Soviet military equipment. The Soviets, aware of this potential complication, moved quickly to pressure Iran for the aircraft's return. They offered various inducements, including favorable terms on existing trade agreements and hints at increased military cooperation. The Soviet Union had been a supplier of weapons to Iran during the war with Iraq, though on a much smaller scale than its support for Baghdad. Moscow walked a careful line, trying to maintain influence with both belligerents while preventing either from achieving total victory. The Su-24 incident threatened to upset this delicate balance. If Iran chose to share intelligence about the aircraft with the United States or other Western powers, it would represent a significant breach of trust and could push the Soviet Union more firmly into Iraq's camp. For nearly 2 weeks, the aircraft remained at Tabriz while diplomats negotiated and intelligence officers worked. Iranian technicians completed their examination, producing detailed reports on the Su-24's capabilities, vulnerabilities, and technological sophistication. These reports confirmed what Western intelligence had suspected. The Fencer was a formidable weapons system, but it was not invincible. Its terrain-following radar, while advanced, had limitations in certain types of terrain. Its electronic countermeasures could be defeated by modern air defense systems. Its avionics, though sophisticated by Soviet standards, lagged behind the latest American systems in some respects. This information was valuable not just for understanding Soviet capabilities, but for developing tactics and technologies to counter them. The crew members, meanwhile, endured their detention with as much dignity as they could muster. They were kept in military custody, separated from each other to prevent coordination of their stories, and questioned repeatedly about their mission, their base, their unit's capabilities, and Soviet operational procedures. The interrogations were professional rather than brutal, focused on extracting information through persistence and psychological pressure rather than physical coercion. The Iranians understood that these men were not spies or saboteurs, but military professionals who had made a mistake or suffered a technical failure. Treating them harshly would complicate negotiations and potentially provoke a stronger Soviet response. On December 4, 1987, after intensive negotiations, Iran agreed to return both the aircraft and the crew to the Soviet Union. The decision reflected several calculations. First, Iran had extracted all the intelligence value it reasonably could from examining the aircraft. Further delay would only antagonize the Soviets without providing additional benefits. Second, the war with Iraq remained the overwhelming priority for Iranian military and political leadership. Maintaining at least neutral relations with the Soviet Union was strategically important, as Moscow could potentially tip the balance by increasing support to Saddam Hussein. Third, there were indications that the Soviets were prepared to take more aggressive action if the aircraft was not returned, possibly including covert operations to destroy it or prevent its technology from being shared with Western powers. The Su-24 was flown out of Iran by a Soviet crew dispatched specifically for the recovery mission. The original crew members were released to Soviet custody and transported back across the border. They returned home not as heroes but as embarrassments, officers who had committed a serious breach of operational security regardless of whether the cause was mechanical failure or human error. Soviet military justice was swift and harsh. Both crew members faced courts-martial for negligence and violation of flight procedures. They were stripped of their ranks, expelled from the Air Force, and sentenced to periods of detention in military facilities. Their careers were destroyed, their reputations ruined. The message to other Soviet military aviators was clear. Mistakes of this magnitude would not be tolerated, and the consequences would be severe. The incident had broader implications that extended far beyond the fate of two unlucky pilots. Within the Soviet Air Force, it triggered a comprehensive review of navigation procedures, equipment reliability, and pilot training. Investigators determined that the navigation system failure, while rare, was not unique to this particular aircraft. Similar malfunctions had occurred in other Su-24s, though none had resulted in such a dramatic border violation. The findings led to modifications in the aircraft's navigation systems, changes to maintenance procedures, and additional training requirements for crews operating near sensitive borders. The Soviet military-industrial complex, always resistant to admitting flaws in its products, was forced to acknowledge that even sophisticated modern aircraft could fail in ways that created strategic vulnerabilities. The diplomatic fallout was more muted than might have been expected. The Soviet Union and Iran both had reasons to minimize public discussion of the incident. For Moscow, it was an embarrassment that highlighted weaknesses in military procedures and equipment. For Tehran, drawing too much attention to the affair might complicate relations with a powerful neighbor at a time when Iran could not afford additional enemies. The incident received limited coverage in Soviet media, mentioned only briefly as a technical malfunction that had been resolved through diplomatic channels. Iranian media gave it somewhat more attention, portraying it as evidence of Iranian military vigilance and the professionalism of Iranian air defenses, but without excessive triumphalism that might provoke Soviet anger. Western intelligence agencies, despite their intense interest, gained less from the incident than they had hoped. The Iranians, calculating that sharing detailed technical intelligence about the Su-24 with the United States would irreparably damage relations with the Soviet Union, kept their findings largely to themselves. Some information did leak through various channels, contributing to the growing Western understanding of Soviet aviation technology, but there was no wholesale intelligence sharing of the kind that occurred when Viktor Belenko defected with his MiG-25 in 1976. The geopolitical circumstances were simply too complex, and Iran's interests too divergent from American interests to permit such cooperation. The incident occurred at a particular moment in Cold War history that made it both more and less significant than it might have been at other times. By late 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev had been in power for more than 2 years, and his policies of glasnost and perestroika were beginning to transform Soviet society and foreign policy. The Soviet Union was looking for ways to reduce tensions with the West, to extract itself from the quagmire in Afghanistan, and to address the deep economic and social problems that threatened the entire Soviet system. A relatively minor incident involving a lost bomber, while embarrassing, was not going to derail these larger strategic initiatives. At the same time, the Iran-Iraq War was entering its final phase, with both sides exhausted by years of brutal combat. The accidental intrusion of a Soviet bomber into Iranian airspace was a sideshow to the main event, a curiosity rather than a crisis. Yet, the incident revealed enduring truths about military operations, technology, and human fallibility. The most sophisticated weapon systems, operated by trained professionals within strict procedural frameworks, can still fail in unexpected ways. The gap between the image of military perfection projected by propaganda and the messy reality of actual operations is often vast. The Soviet military in the 1980s, for all its impressive hardware and numerical strength, suffered from chronic problems: inadequate training, poor maintenance, technological limitations, and a command culture that prioritized obedience over initiative. These problems would become even more apparent in the years ahead as the Soviet Union collapsed and its military forces fragmented. The Su-24 incident also illustrated the complex web of relationships and interests that characterized the Cold War beyond the simple binary of East versus West. Iran in 1987 was neither a Soviet client nor an American ally. It was a revolutionary state pursuing its own interests, willing to engage with both superpowers when advantageous, but fundamentally independent of both. The Soviet Union, despite its ideological rhetoric, was a traditional great power pursuing strategic interests through pragmatic means, willing to overlook ideological differences when necessary. The United States, officially committed to isolating Iran, maintained covert channels and sought intelligence opportunities even with a government it publicly denounced. This multi-layered reality, where official positions and actual behavior often diverged, was typical of Cold War international relations. For the individuals involved, the incident was life-changing in the most profound and negative ways. The 2 crew members, whose names were never publicly released by Soviet authorities, saw their careers, and likely their lives, destroyed by a single mission gone wrong. Whether the cause was mechanical failure, human error, or some combination of both, they bore the ultimate responsibility in a system that demanded scapegoats. Their fate was shared by countless others in Soviet military service who found themselves on the wrong side of accidents, malfunctions, or simple bad luck in a system that showed little mercy to those who failed, regardless of the circumstances. The aircraft itself, after its return to Soviet custody, was thoroughly examined by Soviet technicians to determine exactly what had gone wrong. The findings of this investigation were classified and never publicly released, but they informed subsequent modifications to the Su-24 fleet and influenced Soviet thinking about navigation systems and pilot procedures. The specific aircraft involved in the incident was likely retired from service rather than returned to operational status, as was common practice for aircraft that had been in foreign hands, regardless of the circumstances. The potential that Iranian or Western intelligence agencies had compromised its systems made it a security risk. Looking back from the perspective of decades later, the incident of the Soviet bomber that accidentally flew to Iran seems almost quaint, a minor footnote in the vast history of the Cold War. But it encapsulates so much about that era: the constant tension along borders, the high stakes of military operations, the complex relationships between states that defied simple categorization, and the human cost of technological failure. It reminds us that history is not just made by great leaders making momentous decisions, but also by ordinary people doing their jobs, sometimes making mistakes, and facing consequences that ripple far beyond their individual lives. The Cold War was full of such incidents, most forgotten, some remembered, all contributing to the texture of an era that shaped our modern world in ways we are still discovering.